Good morning. I'm Ellen Stanek, President of Baird Funds and Chief Investment Officer of Baird Advisors. We're thrilled to have you join us this morning for what we promise will be a very interesting discussion, a virtual fireside chat with our friend Dan Clifton. Dan is partner and head of policy research at Strategas Securities. There, he and his team are responsible for the evaluation of the financial market implications of policy and political developments. Included is analyzing trade, tax, healthcare, energy, and other policy initiatives to determine how public policy changes impact the economy and the financial markets for investors. Dan and his team are highly regarded and highly ranked. The number one ranked Washington policy team on Wall Street, according to Institutional Investor magazine. Congratulations. He himself has been a top-ranked Washington policy analyst for 11 straight years and is the top-ranked analyst in the category of tax and accounting policy, a badge of honor. He's widely cited in the media, and Dan is a frequent guest on the financial news, CNBC, Bloomberg, and Fox Business. Prior to joining Strategas, Dan was executive director of the American Shareholders Association, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization which analyzes public policy affecting shareholders. Dan was part of a coalition that successfully lowered capital gains rates and dividend tax rates to 15% in 2003, a repatriation tax holiday on foreign source revenue in 2004, and reform of the nation's private sector pension system. Prior to joining ASA, Dan was federal affairs manager for the Americans for Tax Reform and served as a senior staffer in 2 gubernatorial administrations, working on economic and fiscal policy issues. Dan received both his BA in urban planning and his MS in public policy from Rutgers University, where he was a fellow at the Eagleton Institute of Politics and a Harold Martin Fellow for Public Policy. Good morning, Dan, and welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. Good morning to you as well.
Our team has always valued your work because you have such great insight. You're a clear communicator, so if you're a policy wonk who spends a lot of time, you can get a lot out of these discussions. Or if you're just a casual observer and an institutional investor, you come away with some tidbits and kernels of wisdom. What's always impressed us, Dan, is you do that in such a nonpartisan, apolitical way, and you're trying to strip out. There's plenty of activity and things to talk about, but you strip away or try to strip away the politics to give everybody the facts and the data to try to discern and come to some decisions themselves. So thank you for that. We've often said when we subsequently see outcomes that you must have been in the room when the policy was being developed. And I think one of the things we want our audience to know is you aren't just an observer for Strategas, but you're a trusted partner with many of the policymakers and their staffs, and often is a source of information and fair observation. So again, thank you for all of that work. We're proud of your work, and particularly thrilled that you were able to take the time with our investors today. We have a huge turnout, so lots to talk about and lots of interest. Let's start here. I've heard you describe that we're really experiencing 4 major events, crises, all at the same time, and we've never gone through this, all 4 at the same time. Can you set up this unprecedented environment for us?
That's right. Well, first, I don't like to use the word unprecedented. I think it's overused sometimes. And in this case, that's not true. There are 4 unprecedented transformational events happening at once this election cycle. And you have to remember, elections happen with the background of what's happening behind the scenes. What are those four transformational events? Well, first, we've had a recession this year. Second, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Third, we're experiencing mass protests. And fourth, we're having a presidential election. Just think about the election of President Obama was a transformational event. The election of Donald Trump was a transformational event. We're going to have another one of those this year, irregardless of the other issues. But we're also having a recession. Recessions usually bring about big change. For some people, it hurts them financially. For others, it accelerates technologies. We're going through a pandemic. A lot of talk this morning about vaccines. We've done 6 years of vaccine research in 1 year. How can that be applied to cancer or gene therapy down the road based on the work of the vaccine? And then the mass protests. Usually we get very good social change that comes from protests. Is it a good protest, or is this more violence and people causing crime? We don't, there's probably a little bit of both, but all four of those events have provided change to our country. And on top of that, we've gone back and looked. We've only had 3 of these events ever happen in 1 year previously. That was in 1919, 1958, and 1969. So to have 4 of these events happen at once while we're having an election is really a big deal. And it leads to a possible wider range of outcomes. And that's why we believe that financial markets and participants should be very involved in the events that are going to happen over the next 50 days and possibly what happens after the election, given the nature of these historic events that are taking place.
So lots to unpack there. Let's start with the easy one, the election.
Yeah.
November 3rd. So
Yep.
roughly 50-ish days. Frame it up. What should we watch?
Yeah.
How do you set out? Start with the presidential election and just where do you believe the polls? Where are we?
So because of the unprecedented nature of this election, we're using a framework for investors to be able to understand the election. And I put it in 3 buckets. The first bucket is this a referendum on Donald Trump's first 4 years in office, or is it a choice between Joe Biden and Donald Trump? A president running for re-election wants it to be a choice between 2 candidates. A challenger challenging a sitting president wants to make it a referendum on the first 4 years. My view is presidents get reelected if they govern well and make the other opponent more risky to the voters themselves. And for right now, it really has been a referendum on Donald Trump, largely due to the pandemic over the last few months. We're starting to see that begin to change. We're seeing this in a higher approval rating of the president, and we're starting to see it in higher negative ratings of Joe Biden. That doesn't mean that Donald Trump's going to win, but that Donald Trump is having some success in recent weeks in turning this into a choice between the 2 candidates. And that's why the race has tightened up. I'm sure with you in Wisconsin, you're going to start seeing these candidates there a lot more. So that's number 1. Number 2 is what is happening in the economy and what is happening with COVID-19. Every president that has had a recession 2 years before their reelection has gone on to lose, and every president that has avoided a recession 2 years before their reelection has gone on to win. So it's pretty simple. If you want to win reelection, don't have a recession. And we've had that recession. What we are seeing in Trump's numbers is that Trump's numbers are highly correlated to COVID-19. As COVID cases go up, as the positivity testing ratio goes up, Trump's numbers go down, and vice versa. So here we are in the last month or so with a lower intensity of COVID. It's allowed voters to begin to focus on other issues, such as healthcare and taxes and law and order. And that's why it's becoming a choice. Polls over the weekend show an improving numbers for the president on the economy, where voters give him now an advantage. That is a very big indicator that if COVID remains restrained, the president will likely be more competitive than where the polls show. And then third is what's happening in the swing states. Let's face it, this is not a national election. This is a race to get to 270 electoral votes. Our view is the president could lose the popular vote by 3 to 4% and still win the electoral college. Okay, so right now the president's losing by 7 points nationally. He is losing the swing states by 3.4%. So he's right in that range. And if the president continues to gain steam, then he'll be a lot closer to winning than I think the current consensus gives him credit for. And I would argue that the president's probability of winning this morning is somewhere in the range of 44, 45%. You look at Nate Silver, who's a very prominent election forecaster. He has it at 24% this morning. I understand why his model's suggesting 24%, but it's suggesting that because Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan are very close to going over 50% for Biden. Trump needs to win one of those three. Doesn't need to win all three, but Trump needs to win one of those three. And if he loses all three, then it's going to be very hard for the president to win re-election. I'm just arguing if COVID remains restrained and the economy continues to rebound at the strength that it does, I anticipate the president's numbers will be better on election day
than they are today. Let me give you one other data point. The president is tracking right now his numbers in the swing states almost identical to where he was losing to Hillary Clinton in 2016. So over 50 days, you have a lot of news that can be made. And our anticipation is that the race will be close. But with the caveat, if we have a second wave of COVID later this month and into October, then Biden's probably going to win big. Now, the biggest implication of the president making a better run here
and becoming more competitive is that the Senate races are starting to close. If we were here a month ago, the Republicans were losing about a net 6 seats, which would have given the Democrats about a 53-seat majority, 53-47 majority over the Republicans. In the last month, you've seen that gap close. The Democrats are winning a net 3 seats right now. That means that we're facing a potential for a 50-50 Senate if it holds that way. And watch Michigan. The Republican candidate in Michigan is starting to make some progress there, closing the gap pretty fast here. And so I think the Senate's going to be just as tight, 49-51 for either party, as well as the presidential election. And to sum that up, looks a lot like 2000, 20 years ago. Bush versus Gore, we didn't know who was the president. We didn't know who was going to control the Senate because we really are a 50-50 country. Absent the mistakes parties make that could lead to a larger election one way or another.
So lots there to follow up on. Let's go back to the swing states. You mentioned Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. I will tell you we are seeing both presidential candidates and now the vice presidential candidates with great regularity. So they have figured out that Wisconsin is key. What about some of the other swing states? Talk about Florida, talk about North Carolina, talk about Arizona.
Yeah, I was going to start with Florida when I heard you talk about the swing states. If you notice, Michael Bloomberg announced that he's going to put $100 million into Florida over the weekend. It's very important. If you choke off Florida from the president, not only will it make it almost impossible for the president to win re-election, but we'll also know by 11 o'clock on election night who the winner of the election is. There's a deep concern about a contested election, which I think we should talk about shortly. But if the president loses Florida, it's going to be an early night for the president's campaign, and Biden will probably announce that he'll be president before financial markets open up on Wednesday morning. What is happening in Florida is absolutely incredible. The president has got about a 11 or 12 point better total with Latino voters than he did against Hillary Clinton. And that's why the gap is closing so fast in Florida. A second issue that occurred in Florida is that the president really lost senior citizens during the height of the pandemic. Those are the most at-risk population from COVID. And he's starting to slowly win those voters back. And so the president was losing Florida by 7 points in June. He's now down by about 1.5% to 2% in our polling data. So he's in striking distance. And our expectation is that the president's going to win Florida under the current trajectory right now. Arizona is seeing a similar trend where that's starting to close, but the president is still 4 points down in Arizona. And that's being driven by more suburban, upper income voters who are leaving the president because of his response to COVID and other factors. But where the president is losing in Arizona, he's also making progress in Nevada, a sign that he's doing better with Latino voters, not only in Florida, but in other states, and that gap is closing as well. The president in North Carolina still is behind, and he's struggling there a little bit more. He also has a Senate race where he's not benefiting from. And if I can give you one shocking data point, the president ran behind every Republican Senate candidate in 2016, which means the Republican Senate candidates pulled President Trump over the finish line in the key swing states. Ron Johnson in Wisconsin, Marco Rubio in Florida. The two states you mentioned, North Carolina and Arizona, the president's running ahead of those Republican Senate candidates who are actually pretty poor Senate candidates. So watching those Senate races can tell you a lot about what's going on in the presidential race as well. But those are two areas where the Republicans can lose Senate seats, and it's having an effect on the president's numbers in those states. The president also believes that he's going to win Minnesota, and that gap was closing. It's kind of bounced back a little bit, but I would say the president's down by about 5 points in Minnesota. The president lost Minnesota by 1% in 2016, largely due to surging rural vote that the president has benefited from. So that's another state I would keep an eye on.
So let's go back to those Senate races. The thought that we could end up with a 50-50 Senate, what are the implications?
So 50-50 Senate is a pretty gridlock scenario. And so if the equity market really wants more stimulus, that is probably the worst option to get more stimulus out of. Just in thinking about, kind of fiscal policy on a macro basis, you would have a 50-50 Senate, and those ties would be broken by the vice president, meaning that whoever wins the presidency also controls the Senate. It is very hard to get something done when you have so many moderate senators who are going to be unwilling to buck their party. We lived through this from mid-2001 through the end of 2002. We actually got a lot done at the end of 2002 because of a post-9/11 response, like the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. But absent that, it was very hard to even get economic stimulus. After 9/11 happened, it would be even harder in this environment, in my opinion, given the divergent views of the administration. Now, that being said, we also have a new president. That new president will be popular once he comes in, particularly if it's Biden, and could actually say, hey, I'm going to give you 30% Republicans and I'm going to take 70. Maybe a deal can happen that way. But whether it was Trump, Obama, or George W. Bush, it was 90-10. And that's why deal making got very hard on the stimulus factor. Okay, so that's the stimulus point. On restructuring large-scale industries, it becomes a lot harder to do. So healthcare, status quo remains in healthcare, the Affordable Care Act. Policy will be driven at the state level. Do we expand Medicaid? Okay, big issues for the health insurers, the hospitals. Pharma reform will be done at the executive level, not the legislative level. You will likely not see a major energy reform that you would get from either one of the two parties winning. And again, financial services would be regulated at the executive level. And so if I break that down, it will start to say, what can a president do by executive authority, given that there's going to be congressional gridlock on major sector issues in a divided government scenario?
Lots to think about there, particularly the willingness to use executive authority. Before was kind of a hands-off, very unusual, and the last couple of presidents it has been anything but.
It's a slippery slope, Mary Ellen. So, one takes it one step and the other one goes the next step and the other one goes the next step. And what we're doing right now on executive authority really does stretch the limits of it. The FEMA money for unemployment insurance, the payroll tax deferral. And so I continue to see those limits being pushed. What happened in December of 2019, Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, both of them were leading in the polls. And our team developed a pretty comprehensive report of everything the Democrats can do by executive authority if they come into office. And we caveated that report saying this is designed for a more progressive type of candidate, one that's going to be aggressive in their use of executive power. We don't think Joe Biden fits that mold. What's happened over the last few months is that we've seen Biden indicate he's willing to get a little bit more aggressive on executive power, particularly if he's stuck in gridlock. Another area where we're seeing Biden get a little bit more aggressive than his 44-year record would suggest is that there's a lot of talk about the Democrats ending the filibuster if they have an outright majority in the Senate. The filibuster requires 60 votes in the Senate. This would move that requirement to a majority vote, 51 votes. And if that happened, that would be a very big deal. Biden is an institutionalist, never really wanted to change the filibuster, but I think he sees himself as a one-term president. Midterm elections are usually not good for the incumbent party. They're going to have a short, narrow window to do what they want to do and to, in their view, fix Donald Trump's problems that he created. And I would expect that Biden would be somewhat aggressive on executive power if he does get into office with a very stalemated Congress, whether the Republicans control, whether we're in 50-50, or even if the Democrats have a very slim majority in the Senate.
How about the debates? How important are the debates going to be?
So I'm glad you asked that question because we're 50 days away. We don't really have many catalysts to move the polls. And I keep a journal of what happens every day in the campaign. I went back into my 2016 journal. On September 14th, we were in the throes of such a major presidential campaign. And if you don't live in a swing state, it just doesn't feel the same way right now. It's the pandemic type of election where we're having an election and, you know, maybe they go to a city, maybe they make some news on Twitter or through a press conference, but it doesn't feel like a full-out presidential campaign. And that means that presidential debates are going to have an outsized impact. We were surprised by how few people watch the Republican and Democratic conventions. Now, they happened at the end of August, and people were worried about how their kids were going to go back to school, maybe take a week off before September from work. But it was still very low viewership. And what that told us is that the debates are going to have a heightened impact, particularly the first half hour when everybody is watching. I want to give you a very cool data point on the debates. Most presidents lose their first debate. This happened to Ronald Reagan, who was a great debater. It happened to George Herbert Walker Bush. It happened to Barack Obama, and it happened to George W. Bush. The reason we believe this happens is that presidents aren't spoken to like that for 4 years, and they don't know how to respond being yelled at. You know, and I kind of joke about it, but it's true. What we've noticed is that presidents who are able to get their footing for debate number 2 and improve upon their performance have all gone on to get reelected. George Herbert Walker Bush actually fell even further behind after the second debate, and it was sort of over for him at that point. And so the first debate will matter because it will tell you, can Biden stand up there with Trump? Can Trump effectively turn this into a choice between the two? But I also believe the second debate will be important for whoever loses, whether they can come back on that. We'll have 3 debates and we'll have a vice presidential debate. I also want to make this point, is that Joe Biden debated Paul Ryan in 2012 in the vice presidential debate. Paul Ryan is probably one of the smartest Republicans out there from a budget perspective. And Joe Biden handily beat Paul Ryan in that debate. It moved undecided voters by about 4%, I think was a crucial event in the 2012 reelection of President Obama. And what I'm arguing to you is, one, I think Biden is underestimated in debates, but 2, the vice presidential debate between Pence and Senator Harris could be one that is very important for this election as well. I don't think the Pence versus Tim Kaine debate really was that memorable, but this one could be pretty memorable. The 2016 race was really about Trump versus Clinton, but really watching the Pence-Senator Harris debate, I think will be a little bit more important this cycle than we saw in the last cycle.
So how do you handicap the vice presidential debate? Any insight there?
Well, I do. I mean, Senator Harris had a great first debate in the Democratic primary. I remember a client emailed me while the debate was happening, and I said, Senator Harris just slayed a vice president, meaning Biden. I mean, she really, and her numbers, she took off. And she was in first place for about 2 months, and then the campaign just fell apart. So each debate got worse for her. If she learns from her mistakes and can replicate that first debate, I think that's very important for her to be able to do that, to be able to carry and win, be the sitting president. But if she falls back into some of the trends that she had in November, getting long-winded, getting contradictory, I think Mike Pence will be there to call that out there, and that could be tough for her. So if she's more like the first debate, she'll probably do well. If she's more like her last debate or the last few debates, she'll struggle in that type of debate. Remember, Mike Pence has probably been practicing for this debate since January, even though he didn't know who he was going to be debating, but he only gets one shot. And that's what we think Biden was doing in 2012, practicing a lot.
Let's go to traditional polling, because you've been citing the polls, both national and then statewide polls and particular races. It seems that traditional means of polling have changed dramatically over the last several years, making them less reliable. How much weight do you place in those polls, and what kind of other signals do you look for?
So that's a great question. First, I watch the polls, and I use them as a reference point to have a discussion about what's happening in the race. I like to watch the direction of polls more so than the number. If I have a skewed poll, but I have the same methodology, and it moves 5 points in one direction or another, that will be an important signal for us. So for example, we watch the president's approval rating. We think that's important. Every week, people are being asked, how is the president doing? I don't know if 44% is the right number, but I know it was 40 a month ago, and now it's 44. So that tells us there's incremental progress. So I think there's some value in that. But we have used untraditional metrics to be able to look at political races. 2016, our view was that Trump had a much higher probability of winning than the financial markets or political forecasters were giving him credit for. The betting markets in 2016 were giving Trump a 15% probability. The highest political forecaster was giving him a 30% probability, and we had a 45% probability on Trump. How did we get that number? Well, first, just in a very cool data metric, the S&P 500 has predicted every presidential election since 1984 and has predicted 87% of the presidential election winners since 1928. It's a really simple formula. If the S&P 500 is higher in the 3 months leading into the election, the incumbent party has generally won. And if the S&P 500 is lower in that 3-month period, the opposition party has won, generally. S&P was down about 2% between August 8th and November 8th, 2016. So we think that's a useful metric to watch. If the incumbent party is going to lose, you get a downdrift in September, and you get a really big downdrift right after the first debate in late September, early October. The market, not partisan in any way, new administration, is Biden going to raise taxes or not? Is Biden going to do better trade policy or not? Nobody really knows. So the market de-risks, the equity market de-risks, and kind of waits until that new president takes office before they start having better clarity on how to invest. So that's number one. Number two is that we build portfolios of stocks and say, how are stocks pricing in the election? These are the stocks that are most election sensitive to the election. And those stocks, almost every day since July 5th, was reducing Hillary Clinton's probability of winning the election. For example, in the final 2 weeks of the election, you had bank stocks and fossil fuel stocks rallying. Those are not exactly stocks you'd be buying if you thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. And what I'm arguing to you is I believe that there's a lot of wisdom in financial markets of understanding the election much better than the polls and the pundits did in 2016. And we use that as a supplement to our forecast of what's happening in the polling data. I'll give you another example. We have 8 presidential elections of the US dollar. In 7 of those 8 elections, a weaker dollar has projected that the incumbent party is going to win. So if you look at where stocks are and you look at where the dollar is, they're almost giving a 50-50 chance for either candidate right now, which is different than what the consensus is. The consensus believes that Biden's going to win. Our Biden portfolio of stocks, the individual stocks, are giving Biden about a 60% chance of winning. So one of the things that why we're having a conversation about what Trump needs to do to win is because we're saying, okay, here's what the market is thinking. Here's what could change over the next 50 days or so. And so that's why we emphasize what does Trump need to do to get back in this race, given kind of where the consensus is in these stocks. And I'll just throw you one funny type of way of thinking about it. I had a client call me in and said, hey, we think Trump's going to win in 2016. What stocks should we buy? And we said, private prisons. They said, we brought you here to tell us to buy a small cap REIT, but those are the pure plays on an election like this. Prisons, student lenders, and for-profit education, because they have very binary outcomes on who's going to win the presidency. You don't need to know who's going to win the Senate. Both of them are going to go in different views. Trump's going to give them more business. Biden's going to give them less business. And those have been the most telling signals about the presidential race. And again, they're right at 42% probability this morning.
Okay, let's go to mail-in balloting.
Yes.
Another real issue for this election in terms of just accuracy of the potential outcome, probability in terms of one set of voters voting early, voting by mail. So walk us through that, and particularly some insight on state by state, how the rules vary pretty dramatically in terms of both the window to vote as well as how and when the votes actually get counted.
I think that's the right question. So in 2016, our message was Trump has a better chance to win. You should prepare yourself for that event. Our message in 2020 is that we can have real election chaos here, and you should be prepared for these types of outcomes. I don't want to scare anybody, but when you see both parties preparing for the eventual challenge of this election, our antennas go up. And while Trump gets a lot of attention because he tweets publicly that he reserves the right to bring liability, the Democrats are also preparing for this and doing so in a very public way, that if Trump wins the Electoral College, but not the popular vote, they will not concede until all the votes are cast. So really, there are three areas that I would be focused on right now in terms of where some of this election confusion can come from. The first is, when do the ballots have to be in? I'm less concerned about this because it's the easiest one, but in a number of states that you just referenced, those ballots do not have to come in until November 9th, but they have to be postmarked by November 2nd. So you have to be postmarked by the election, but they're not going to be received by the election officials until a week later. Think about that. Trump wins huge on election night, almost looks like a landslide. And as a result, his lead just gets cut down as more and more mail-in ballots start to come out. You can almost see the picture of him on Twitter from the White House saying the election was rigged. And we saw this in Arizona in 2018, where the Republican Senate candidate, Martha McSally, won on election night, and slowly her lead dissipated, and she ultimately lost the election because of these late ballots starting to come in. It's a huge issue. And the second issue, which I think is more relevant and more pertinent to the swing states, is when those ballots need to be counted. Because Florida and a lot of the southern eastern states like Georgia, North Carolina, they're going to start counting before Election Day, and they're very efficient in getting those ballots voted and tallied up. We had a primary in Florida in August, and we knew every winner by 11 o'clock at night. It was very smooth. The problems start to become Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and really what we're trying to get at is, are these states going to change their laws before Election Day, which will allow them to start verifying signatures, which is a timely process, and counting those votes ahead of time. Pennsylvania is thinking about doing that. If they do that, I think that's very good for better election certainty. But we would like to see all the swing states make that change so that we can have a better read of what's going to happen on election day and avoid some of the issues that are out there. I think about it almost like a giant piñata at a kid's party, right? The piñata is hanging out. And if you hang it out for a week or 2 weeks, it's just going to keep getting hit and hit and hit until something breaks. And there's always irregularities with election. That does not mean fraud. And those irregularities get emphasized while that vote is being hung out there. So that's number two. Number three is just absolutely critical, is there's a very high error of absentee balloting and vote in mail because most people have never done it before. Signatures don't get signed, all sorts of issues associated with it. In some states, we're looking at an 8% rejection of absentee ballots. That happens, it could move the vote by 1 or 2% to the Republican candidate because we're anticipating that the Democrats are going to vote by a much larger amount vote in mail relative to the Republicans. If that happens, you could see a state like Wisconsin or Minnesota, which is going to be very close, swing the Republican, and then we're going to have court challenges about whether those votes should get thrown out because we knew what the voters' intention were, but we don't know, they didn't fill it out correctly. My experience in politics is once you go in the courtroom on voting, you lose all legal case. What happens is it becomes about whether a judge is going to disenfranchise other American voters and that judge's fellow citizens, and they just don't want to do that. So that's where the chaos comes in. You're conflicting with a goal of everybody should vote versus what the legal rules are, and it creates a lot of volatility around that. And so we're preparing for election volatility, assuming the race is going to be close. As I mentioned earlier, if Trump loses Florida and Florida does its count pretty efficiently, which we expect, none of this will really matter, and we're wasting a lot of time and energy on it. But we believe people should be, especially investors, should be prepared for some sort of election volatility that's going to result from an increase in mail-in voting.
One piece of data, one of the things we really respect a ton about your work is just you put data in front of people, and you made this very point again. In Wisconsin, in the April 7th election, there was over 23,000 absentee ballots that were rejected. And Trump, you put that into the framework of Trump won Wisconsin overall by 22,748 votes. So to your point, these rejected absentee ballots could end up being yet another battleground that someone hasn't contemplated.
Absolutely. And even if everything is done according to book and Trump wins the Electoral College but not the popular vote and is winning states because the absentee rejection rate is greater than his margin, I would expect protests to result from that and really not recognizing in some places that Trump won the Electoral College. And that's where that next leg of volatility can come from, where you know the winner and you're still getting the protests that result from it. And so again, I'm an optimist. I think all this stuff works itself out. I've been deeply concerned about the election process, just given the nature of the way the pandemic is changing how we vote and everything else in our lives. But it's also going to affect how we count the votes and how we accept the votes.
So pivoting a little bit here, Dan, I want to spend a minute or two on the social unrest that you referred to and thinking about the unrest in this really historic time period in this country. And President Trump is drawing a very sharp contrast with Vice President Biden on this issue. How do you see this impacting the election, and particularly how do you see it impacting voter turnout?
So I think voter turnout's going to be really high. We got the Fox News poll over the weekend, and what it showed is that there's no difference between registered voters and likely voters in the election. That's very rare. Usually there's a 2 or 3 point swing between registered and likely voters. And what it's saying is that people who are going to vote for Biden are just as energetic to vote as people for Trump. Okay, that's not been the case throughout this cycle. Now it's starting to form that way, which tells us that people have very big feelings one way or another, law and order versus social justice, and it's actually driving turnout. And it looks like we're going to have a record number of Americans voting. That's great. We should be celebrating this. This is really what we are hoping for. And by the way, if people tell you the vote is being suppressed, it's hard to argue that when we're seeing record turnouts in the primary and general election. Like, I think it's working, what we're trying to do. It's great. What is happening here is that in that Fox News poll, they asked, is this more violence or social or good protest? And more people are now saying it's violence than protest, okay? Which is a big change because initially we were protesting in response to a social injustice that has happened. Now voters are starting to go, well, I think we might be losing our original intention. You would think that that's helping Trump. It actually isn't improving his numbers. And so it's allowing him to have a debate on these issues, maybe bring in some voters he normally didn't get, particularly older voters who were worried about COVID. But overall, it's not impacting the top line numbers in the data that we're actually looking at. And so maybe it will change. But as you hear, like we woke up today with more police officers dying, all violence is bad, regardless of where it's happening. And I think both candidates are going to be sensitive to that. But I really think this election is about COVID and the economic impact of COVID. And Joe Biden is telling you that. I mean, the Biden campaign are very worried about Trump's numbers on the economy, the number of articles about it today of the Biden campaign signaling that, and Bernie Sanders saying that as well to Biden, that he's got to be more proactive than just saying that Trump is bad. So it's changing the mix of the issues. And I think that's important. It's telling you that it's more of a choice versus a referendum. But I still think this is about the economy and COVID.
So on COVID, you referred this morning, we're getting some additional positive sense that we're getting closer on some kind of vaccine. What are your friends at NIH indicating, and just how quickly and how realistic is it that we're going to see some positive news here?
First, we're learning to live with COVID. I think that's an important data point for society overall, not just about the election itself. But I had a policymaker ask me the other day and said, what does Trump need to do to win? I said, let me reframe that to you. And I said, if Trump wins, it will be because of the proper implementation of this rapid test. On Friday, the administration approved the distribution of that rapid test, and it will start getting distributed to the states. For $5 in 15 minutes, you can know whether you have COVID or not. This is a total game changer because it allows for schools, hospitals, senior citizens, even concerts to be able to adopt it, and allows you to be able to live a little bit better. But most importantly, it could stop a large second wave spread from coming into play. So if my point is, I think the testing in the short run may be the most important data point around the therapeutics of COVID-19. Second is that Pfizer CEO is out this morning, AstraZeneca CEO over the weekend, and they're arguing that they'll know if they're effective vaccine by October or by the end of the year, depending on the company. We're not going to have a vaccine by the election. We're going to know if we're going to have a vaccine probably right before the election. I don't believe it's political in nature, although it has the timing of running into political season. I'm sure the general counsel at large publicly traded corporations would not let their CEOs go out there and say something that couldn't be verified at this point, like they're saying right now. And that's one of the reasons why we don't think it's political. There's also, from the health professionals, just a bullishness that you normally don't see around these types of events. They feel like they're on top of this, absent some major, drawback in the effectiveness of the test. They're also increasing the number of participants in the study. The Pfizer study is going from 30 to 40,000 participants in the next couple of weeks. They're also bringing in some HIV patients to see how it interacts with other diseases. These are all positive signals. And I don't forecast on drug approvals. That's not what I do. But what I could argue is that, I just put it in the context of what happens in my family, is I believe that my wife's going to try and book a Disney trip for next year if she hears there's a vaccine and say, okay, well, we need that vacation and we have young kids at home and they're going to need something, and it may not be Disney, but it's almost like a confidence factor. In a year from now, we'll be able to do X or Y. And I think that's going to be the important implication of the vaccine for the American public. And, by nature, that helps an incumbent party one way or another, just as any type of positive event would help a sitting president.
So you've been around Washington a long time, and agree or disagree with this statement that both parties, people have moved farther right, farther left, and the moderates are few in number and far between. Do moderates still exist? Those independents who are going to swing elections?
So I think both sides have become more polarized, including their voters. But the real issue here is the way that we do redistricting. Just as a side project, I'm a big believer in redistricting reform because I believe the system that you've just discussed is a product of redistricting. Nearly every member of Congress is more worried about losing in a primary than in a general election, given the nature of the uncompetitive legislative districts. If that's the case, and I reject what my base is trying to do, they will come up with an alternative candidate to primary me. And basically that's what's happened this cycle. It's very rare to see 10 incumbent members of Congress lose in a primary like we saw on both sides this time around. So it is happening. And that's why we've become more polarized on a voting record. That's different than watching Fox News or MSNBC and where you get your media from. But look at Iowa. Iowa is a model for the nation. Both parties talk about redistricting reform in their own self-interest. They want to draw the lines themselves. But in Iowa, they make it counties and contiguous. Okay? And when they do that, there's no political consideration to the gerrymandering. And Iowa always has competitive congressional elections and the moderate voter that you are thinking about right now. And so my sense is that if you had that system throughout the country, you'd have a lot more moderation, a lot more deal making, and a lot more members of Congress working with the other side. I think it's less about what you hear. Well, they don't spend time in Washington anymore. They don't get to know each other. I think it's less of that. Because at the end of the day, it's always about, can I keep this great job that I have in Washington? And I'm going to do everything I can to protect it. That's what they're saying to themselves. And so you've got to make the general election more costly to them than the primary. And that's what we got to get back to.
So potential tax changes, when we think about practical implications for individuals as well as corporate, walk us through both sides in terms of what's at stake.
So the president's pretty easy. The president was thinking about doing a tax reform pre-COVID, 2 income tax brackets, paid for by raising taxes on endowments. I hope there's no endowments on. I don't want to deliver that bad news to any of your endowment clients. Raising taxes on endowments and trying to close off some loopholes on how the very ultra wealthy distribute money to political organizations. That was the plan. The way the White House thought about it is they got corporate pretty good in 2017. They got individual pretty bad in 2017. So they wanted to fix the individual side. I think that's less likely, and the president's now just talking about payroll tax cuts and other types of fiscal policy stimulus. The Biden plan is one that's really interesting to us because it is very aggressive, more aggressive than what people talk about. The Biden plan overall is about 1.5% of GDP. The Obama, George Herbert Walker Bush, and Bill Clinton tax increases were 0.3, 0.4, and 0.4% of GDP. So you're talking about 4 to 5 times larger if you did everything that Joe Biden was seeking to propose. The Biden campaign have really been going out of their way to say, hey, this is going to be later in the year. We're not going to do it right away. We want to make sure the economy is recovering from COVID. I believe that. But the vice president came out on Thursday in the CNN interview and said he is going to do a major tax increase on day one of the corporate tax rate. And that was striking because his advisors had been going in a completely different direction, and it could be done. Congress gets sworn in on January 3rd. The president gets sworn in on January 20th. They can literally pass legislation between January 3rd and January 20th on fiscal policy, stimulus, and taxes, and have it ready for the new president when he gets back from his walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. So, you know, I've been studying tax policy my whole life. We have a pretty good read, and I'm a bit confused because I don't know if they're going to start off with it right at the beginning or later in the year. But they are telling you it is a priority to get that corporate tax rate up to about 28%, and as well as a foreign source revenue tax. On the individual side, I can tell you that Biden wants to get the capital gains and dividend tax rate up. He wants to get it up equalized with ordinary income. They believe that the stock market is not the economy, and that as the stock market has gone up, it's been due to stock buybacks, and that has resulted in less investment and less job creation. That's important because they're telling you they don't believe, the Biden campaign does not believe raising the corporate tax rate is going to hurt job growth. And that means that there's going to be less consideration to the state of the economy if the revenue could be used for infrastructure, climate change spending, and other types of fiscal policy stimulus itself. And so these are pretty significant changes. The last time the capital gains rate was over 30% was 1978. Jimmy Carter reduced the capital gains tax from 48 to 28% because he felt it was harming the economy. And we've never put it over 30% since. So it may not turn out that it goes up to 43.4, but it is likely to go up if the Democrats sweep. And remember, that's a key caveat. The Democrats have to sweep. You get divided government, you get none of the tax increases, you get all the benefits of Biden on international trade. And that's why you're seeing the dollar weaken somewhat. It's a reflection of the America First trade going out, the Biden trade coming in, and is actually very good for financial conditions, that weak dollar with no tax increase. That would be viewed as a pretty bullish scenario. Maybe you don't need fiscal policy stimulus in that because you're getting it from the financial markets.
So we've got lots of questions already submitted from our,
Awesome. Great.
our audience. Just a reminder for our box, you can submit questions live, and Dan promises even if we run out of time, we will get answers. Dan, first one that's come in from a political perspective, do deficits matter to anyone in Washington anymore?
What a great question. Secretary Mnuchin was on TV today saying we shouldn't be worried about the deficit right at this time. And so, you know, Liz, we have a $3 trillion deficit. People want to make sure that we're going to be okay for the pandemic. Most of the unemployed are unemployed through no fault of their own other than a pandemic. We should be spending to make sure that nobody has hardship during this time until we get back to a somewhat normal scenario. And so that will be the guiding principle. The financial markets are not sending any concern about the deficit at a 10-year Treasury rate at 0.6%. But on July 31st, 2021, the United States is going to have to raise its debt ceiling. And so the catalyst to dealing with this may be on the political side, not on the economic side. And I'd also keep an eye on inflation as well. But if you look at defense stocks aren't doing well even when the Republican odds go up. A sign that the market is viewing some level of austerity will have to come at some point, given the nature of the deficits. It's just not right now. Last point I'll make on this is that the financial crisis really established monetary policy, a more active monetary policy. The pandemic has basically crystallized a more active fiscal policy. And the two have worked really well together in 2020. And so I do believe that we'll use fiscal policy more in the future. We have a pretty good model on how to deal with these temporary dislocations, but it's not sustainable to keep running $3 trillion deficits and have a debt to GDP ratio at 100%.
Here's another question on just what's the political reality of the country as contrasted with more of a left-leaning bias in the media?
Yeah, so I would agree with that. The media, some of them who are my friends and who came to my wedding, have taken on a more active role in being a fact checker to the president. And I do think that you would see a sea change if Biden won. The market looks through this pretty incredibly. Like I'm just totally in awe every day how the market can look through all the noise. They do a very good job of it. I think political trends are changing as well, where consumers of news are now being able to look through it because it's become so obvious of where the kind of attention and focus and balance is. That's not to say that they're not doing what they should be doing. I think if you saw it happening on both sides, you would actually see a more well-responded consumer. But I think it goes back to what you mentioned before. We're just polarized. People are playing into that. I'll give you one example. The most contrarian trades going into 2016 election was, okay, I think Trump's going to win. What should I be long? What should I be short? Well, you would want to be long the New York Times and you'd want to be short gun owners, which is almost the opposite of what you would think. But basically, Trump won, people stopped buying guns, and Trump won, and Democrats needed media all the time to kind of just continue to write that over again. So I would think about this election the opposite way. If Biden wins, I think you're going to see a big fall off in consumer use. Oh, the world went back to normal for all those people that are getting all those subscriptions. And you're already seeing the gun companies really starting to price in on the twin combination of increasing violence and the possibility of the Democrats winning and pursuing some sort of gun control legislation.
Will we see another fiscal stimulus plan?
So I've been very bullish on a fiscal stimulus plan. I don't make these numbers up. I think there was a pretty high level of optimism amongst the White House, the Senate, Republicans, and the House Democrats that we would get a plan. We're slowly reducing those odds. We're below 50% today. In fact, my note this morning argued that the Federal Reserve should step up in the absence of fiscal policy stimulus by using their unused CARES Act and actually developing a program for consumers to be able to take loans at collateral level as a way to get through the fiscal policy stalemate. The question is, when are we going to get that fiscal policy? If the Democrats sweep in the election, you'll get it early in 2021. If you have some sort of divided government, do you do this in lame duck? But it's getting increasingly harder to do this over the next 50 days. As I mentioned before, the president's numbers are going up as the economy starts to rebound here. And the Democrats believe that Obama undershot on the economy, President Obama, and that they want about $3 trillion, $2 to $3 trillion of additional fiscal policy. So we don't undershoot this time. That's a really hard gap to fill in the 50 days before the election.
Okay, so we've only got a couple of minutes left. Your prediction first on the presidential race and the probability, and then Congress.
Yeah, so I think under the current, I don't think Trump is going to be able to close the gap right now. I don't think he's going to be able to close the gap as much as he needs to. So I think Biden's going to win. I think it's going to be a close election. And I do think that the Republicans are going to hold the Senate and we're going to have divided gridlock. The reason why we have that view that the Republicans need to win in states that are not consequential to the presidential election, like Montana, like some of the other Iowa, where I think Trump's going to win anyway. And my sense is that they're going to hold the Senate and we're going to have gridlock. That is a very unique scenario that I just outlined, and one that's not the consensus because every president since George Herbert Walker Bush, and I think only 3 presidents in the last 50 or 60 years have started with a Senate of the other party when that new president comes in. I would just say that if this was 2016 and I was more bullish on Trump than most, I still would have told you that Hillary was going to win on September 14th, 2016. So events will change, and we changed actually on October 28th, which is where we raised our probability for Trump to the point where we said that he could really win this thing. There's a long way to go between now and then. So I hope you don't hold me to that. But I think that's kind of where the election is at this point.
Lots of life to live till then. Final comment, any practical takeaways for investors?
Yeah, it depends on your long-term or short-term horizon from where the election is right now. And I actually argue there's weakness here, but I can give you a simple chart of the S&P 500 and label political parties under there, and it just goes straight up over time. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to go straight up again, but there's always twists and turns. New administrations are really difficult for presidents to adjust to. This time around, we have two who are experienced, so maybe a little bit less so. But I can remember February of 2009 or April of 2001. They were rough months with new presidents of both political parties. I can tell you I worked on 2 transitions in governor's offices, and those are much smaller than the federal government, and we still struggled to that. So give them a little bit of time, whoever's the president, to get their sea legs in. And at the end of the day, presidents want the economy to do well. And I think that's been good advice to serve investors once you get past the twists and turns.
Well, Dan, thank you very much. We always feel like the time flies by whenever we have the privilege to talk with you. Thank you so much for taking the time. We will be watching closely your work over the next 50 days. And again, on behalf of all of us at Baird and Baird Funds, thank you.
Great. Thank you for having me. Appreciate being here today.
And our next quarterly call for investors is Tuesday, October 6th at 10 o'clock Central. Feel free to sign up for that call and register with us. The entire investment leadership team is available, and on that call, we do a recap of what's happened year to date and then a look forward. Again, thanks very much. Thanks to Dan Clifton. Bye-bye.